My name is Patty Johnson, and I'm the canon missioner here at the Washington National Cathedral. And on behalf of the Dean, Gary Hall, and our Bishop, Mary Ann Buddy, it's my profound honor to welcome you here to this, your National Cathedral, a national house of prayer for all people. So welcome, and we hope to see you back here on many other occasions, in particular the next 2 consecutive Tuesday evenings. I would love to begin this evening with a short prayer, if we might. Dear Holy One, dear Blessed Spirit, we gather here this evening to listen. We gather here to work toward understanding. We gather to find new togetherness with our Muslim brothers and sisters. Give us ears to listen deeply and minds open wide enough to accept and embrace differences. Above all, give us hearts to connect with one another, with all our brothers and sisters. Tonight, help us journey toward a world with one people, one loving people. Let us be an instrument of peace which passes all understanding. Amen. And now it's my honor to introduce to you Grace Saeed, who is the chairman of our Palestine-Israel Advocacy Group here at the Cathedral.
Thank you and welcome. I am Grace Saeed, and I chair the Palestine-Israel Advocacy Group. Our group is sponsoring this series. By way of introduction, I'd like to tell you something very brief about myself and recount 2 stories that are many years apart, yet very similar in their content. I belong to a rich and varied culture in which my Christian faith coexists happily with the largely Muslim culture in which I grew up. The motivation for this series is based primarily on the blending of many components that make up the identity of many of us from the Middle East region, including Dr. Haddad. Now for the stories. Here's the first. In 1980, Edward Said, the literary critic and my brother, tried to interest a New York publisher who was then looking for third world books to publish in the work of Naguib Mahfouz, the great Egyptian novelist. And here I'm going to quote Edward. After a little reflection, the idea was turned down. When I inquired why, I was told, with no detectable irony, that Arabic was a controversial language. Mahfouz later went on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1988. Second story. A few weeks ago, Amir Zahar, a publisher of the Civil Arab blog, wrote about an incident in upstate New York. And I'm going to quote him now. Many residents of the small town got all bent out of shape. Pine Bush High School decided to celebrate National Foreign Language Week by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in a few different tongues. The plan was to have students narrate the pledge in Italian, Japanese, French, Spanish, and yes, Arabic. Well, on Wednesday, an Arabic-speaking student took to the school's intercom and pledged allegiance to the flag in her heritage's language. And exactly what you imagine might happen, happened. Some students started hissing and booing, and a number of parents called the school in protest. By the end of the day, the principal announced an apology over the school's intercom system. Much of the uproar revolved around that all-important passage of the pledge, one nation under God. When translated into Arabic, God, as all Americans know, with much thanks to Fox News, becomes Allah. Amir then goes on to explain the etymology of the word Allah, which is Arabic for God, and how it is used by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Both these stories illustrate ignorance and misinformation surrounding anything Arab and currently anything Muslim. The mainstream media, our forever growing roster of experts, and some well-known talk show hosts have made matters worse by sensationalizing news, relying on dubious claims, and trading in fear. Islamophobia is on the rise, and as Reverend John Peterson mentioned in a forum here a couple of weeks ago, it is based in large part on fear of the other. This series on Islam is an attempt to provide you with information from scholars and analysts who hopefully will provide you with answers to many of your questions about Islam and what it has to offer to many. We are all enormously grateful to Dr. Yvonne Haddad, who has so graciously offered her knowledge, expertise, and time in framing this series. Before I introduce Yvonne, let me just say that the format is going to be one in which Dr. Haddad and Dr. Hussein will have a conversation, and then we will have, each one will speak briefly, a conversation will follow, and then we will have questions from the floor. And you can, Ruth is providing papers and pencils for you to begin to write your questions. And well, so that's the program. So Dr. Haddad is professor of the history of Islam and Christian-Muslim relations at Georgetown University. She has taught Islamic studies at many universities and conducted research on 20th century Islamic thought in Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, and Tunisia. Dr. Haddad has served as the past president of the Middle East Studies Association and the American Academy of Religion, New England region. She is the recipient of a Fulbright Senior Research Fellowship, a Distinguished Research Fellow from the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and a Carnegie Research Fellowship. I could, of course, mention a lot more, but I think you get the picture. Dr. Haddad and Dr. Hussein, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce Dr. Hussein. Altaf is a very important rising scholar of Islam in the United States. He's assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Howard University. He is a native of Cleveland, Ohio, but right now he lives in Northern Virginia. His recent scholarship on Muslims of America includes Islamophobia, Anti-Islamic Bigotry, published in the Encyclopedia of Social Work. And then he wrote an article on volunteerism among American immigrant Muslims. We looked all over the country for somebody to write that piece because we edited a volume called Muslims, the Oxford Handbook of American Islam, and he was the only expert in the whole country. Wow. Okay? So I'm delighted that he agreed to show up tonight. He also wrote an article on Muslim leadership in the US context. He co-authored a special joint issue on religion and spirituality. And recently, he won a special award. And there's a sign in the back, if you haven't seen it. He is Educator of the Year Award at Howard University, and he has just gotten tenure. He serves as the vice president of the Islamic Society of North America, and he's on their advisory board also of the Peaceful Family Project, and he was for 2 consecutive terms the national president of the Muslim Society of North America, which is the largest student Muslim organization in North America, in US and Canada. Dr. Altaf will speak, and then I'm going to quiz him. I just came from class, and I'm ready with all questions that my students gave me.
Thank you so much. Good evening, and thank you so much to the Washington National Cathedral for this invitation. I'm grateful to not only the cathedral, to the dean and the bishop for the invitation and for opening this, what I call a road, to create further bridges between people of different faiths. I'm especially grateful to, where did she go, Grace Said, for facilitating, recommending, developing and recommending the idea for the series. We look forward to the other 2 lectures as well. And of course, to my contact, the canon missioner, Patty Johnson, for making life so much easier in terms of how to find the cathedral and then how to find parking at the cathedral. And of course, I don't want to over-exaggerate what Dr. Yvonne Haddad has done to the idea of research-driven understanding. She's not someone who does interfaith work, because clearly her academic work keeps her so occupied, but she has done research-driven, a data-driven understanding of different faiths, but particularly the Arab and Muslim community. And to show you how much of a nerd in terms of studying I am, I can actually say I grew up on her writings. So that's how much she's affected me. So I'll divide my comments for the next 8-10 minutes into 3 sections. One is my story, then just a brief mention of our beliefs, and then our story, the community. My story essentially is that I'm a son of immigrants from India. And so my father followed the typical American immigrant pattern, if you will, came here to study, to do his PhD, fell in love with the country and of course the openness of the country, and decided that this was the best place to raise his Muslim children, would be in America. And so we followed my mother and my 3 sisters, and then my entire background or socialization is through the public school system. So I'm a product of the American public school system, having for the first 10 years of my life attended a Catholic school in India. So the reach is far and wide. And then, of course, I was socialized as well by neighbors, which is something I think in our Q&A I will address, that the reason some of the challenges we're facing in terms of misunderstanding and misconceptions is that many of the neighbors in Parma, Ohio, so by introduction, I am a Cleveland Indian, if you get that. If you don't get that, I'll wait for you outside to explain that. And they were World War II veterans who had been stationed every part of the world, but particularly also India. So when we moved into Parma and onto our street, these were the people with whom we helped mow the lawn or chop wood, and they would tell us stories of America. I think if more immigrants, as they came into America, had that sort of an invitation, if you will, or interaction, we wouldn't possibly be in the place where we are today. The college career is much like the typical immigrant college career, which was that my mother wanted a doctor. My father very much thought I was an engineer, and the loving son gave them a biomedical engineering degree. Before then I moved on in my senior year to have a wake-up call through a very terrible car accident to take up social work. And then I pursued that through my master's and my PhD in social work. I am also married to a daughter of immigrants. So I'm in an interracial marriage by virtue of myself being from India, and my wife and my mother-in-law and sister-in-law and other cousins and relatives are here, are from Egypt. So in that sense, I'm also something that wouldn't happen any other part of the world, perhaps as often as in America, where people of the same faith but of different racial and ethnic backgrounds are coming together. So it is a typically American story, and that's something that my wife and I tell our children all the time, and indeed anyone who would listen, that we really are convinced that at this time, in this date, in this century, there is no other place to raise our Muslim family than right here in America. And I don't say that because I'm running for office or anything. Second, in terms of our beliefs. How they play out is that the reality of the religion is you are a Muslim wherever you are. You are to follow the law of the land unless and until any part of the law forces you to contradict your faith. There's absolutely nothing within the Constitution that has yet to give us pause to say that something in the Constitution contradicts our faith. In fact, we are enriched by the First Amendment and the idea that we can fully practice our religion with the support not only of the government for us and for any other faith, but also for the system that has been set up by virtue of the non-profit structure, whereby churches, masjids, and other organizations can then serve the needs of the Muslims. So you may know that we pray 5 times a day, and Dr. Haddad wanted to quiz you. So sometimes that means for me that I'm waiting for a flight, and it's prayer time, and it's just around pre-dawn. So I go to the agent, and I tell her, I know you're going to be boarding soon, but I'll be praying right over in that corner. So if I'm in Kentucky, for example, when I come to board, she will say, hey, how was your prayer? And I have to say, oh, it was great. And then we go on. And other times when I'm unsure of the direction because I'm in a rush towards the Kaaba, the Middle East, if you will, in Saudi Arabia, Kaaba, then sometimes the best people to know directions at an airport are pilots. So as they're walking about, I'll walk up to them and say, how are you? I know you're in a rush. I'm Muslim. I need to pray. What do you think Northeast is? And they'll actually look out the window, and they'll look. One of the pilots even offered to watch my bags as I prayed. So this happens through growing up American, that I have no sense of a schizophrenia about who I am, that I'm not paranoid about who I am, that I can be who I am and feel comfortable that the law of the land protects me in being the best of who I am as a Muslim. Then when we fast, for example, I may be anywhere at home or out in the community, and it's time to break our fast. And so we just plan right ahead so that at sunset we would break our fast with whatever is available to eat, and then we would make our prayers. And then you would notice also that a lot of the community, because of the 29 nights of congregational prayer, starts to also get engaged in that routine. And this creates a sense of enthusiasm among children, and more than anything else, memories of what a peaceful life they've had in America, being able to practice their faith and to do it to the fullest degree. And that's something, a part of the beliefs. And the third part, when we talk about zakat, or the institution of giving charity, the obligatory charity, but also the voluntary charity. One of the reasons I was very excited to accept the invitation of Dr. Haddad and Professor Jane Smith to write a chapter on volunteerism was that this was something that I grew up with. That my parents, our day fell on Sunday, if you will, to go to the masjid in Cleveland, would often make time after prayers and the Sunday school to go and visit people who were sick or who needed some kind of help. I didn't like it at the time because it was keeping me from whatever else I wanted to do as a early tween or a teenager. But it ingrained in me this idea that one of the central core aspects of the belief of the religion is this idea to give to others, is to always know that the collective well-being is critically more important as you attempt to come into your own as an individual. And so that was ingrained in me, and that's one of the pillars, if you will, as it's called, of the religion. And of course the pilgrimage, the annual pilgrimage is also there, which the latest estimates show about 2 million people that would make that pilgrimage to Mecca. And lastly, just as the opening comments, and we'll have much more to say with Dr. Haddad, is our story. What is our story as a community? So if in any of even the most modest estimates, the arrival of Islam in America traced to the arrival of slaves, particularly from West Africa, even if a modest number of them followed Islam, it would still be that Islam had arrived, whether it came through enslavement or as later on through voluntary migration. And so that was a presence. So as the slaves became freed after the Civil War, it was still a presence, and whoever had held on to Islam was still a presence. And we have some stories, if you will, throughout American history of other Muslims who came, and we know of them, but there wasn't anything beyond a presence. The community begins to form in 1940s and 50s, predominantly with the arrival of students, and then, of course, with the, which is this year, 2015, will mark the 50th anniversary of the landmark legislation which abolished the quota system within American immigration laws and opened up immigration to North Africa, Middle East, and of course, Asia. And so that community begins to form by virtue of students realizing that on college campuses, they need some kind of an association to preserve their faith, to mobilize each other, to basically practice the faith. And so the Muslim Student Association, as Dr. Haddad mentioned, is the precursor to many other organizations. As people learned how to organize, how to really be a public speaker or a manager or a treasurer, in the volunteer organizations that we have. And that led to a few national organizations being formed. And really, the last decade and almost 15 years now, what we see, and as I close with that comment, what we see is the emergence of specialized organizations. That these are second and third generation Muslims from all over the world, and also not only born and raised here, but they trace their background to all over the world, whereby you have, for example, the American Muslim Health Professionals Association. And this is people who are medical doctors and other professionals. We have also organizations, as Dr. Haddad mentioned, called the Peaceful Families Project, dedicated to the prevention and indeed eradication of domestic violence. And this is a topic, and I see Heidi Christensen here with the Health and Human Services and others. We've been talking about this because it's not just a Muslim problem or just any particular faith's problem. It's a human problem when people cannot control their anger and their harshness. And it's directed, regrettably, towards family members and sometimes to very terrible ends. So these are specialized organizations. The Islamic Medical Association, for example, mostly medical doctors, Muslim social workers were now starting to emerge, and others. So what I wanted to say in these few minutes, just generally to sum it up, is that I represent, in a way, most of what Muslim Americans are all about, in the sense that the Pew Report titled it, mostly middle class and mostly mainstream. That this is the story, and this is who we are, this is how we've come about, and this is what we believe. And hopefully through not only the dialogue we will have and the questions perhaps that you shall raise, we will have indeed a fruitful conversation. And again, I thank the Cathedral for the invitation.
Thank you very much. I want to make a couple announcements. You all answered the quiz. You all have the answers.
You have a pre-test?
What did you learn from the test? How did you divide it? They're all from the Quran. That's right. If anybody wants the exact verse numbers, I have them. If you sign your name at the back, we can give them to you. The other thing, if you want a copy, we have a glossary of all the Islamic terms. And we have only a few copies of it, but we can email it to you. So if you want a copy, there is a sign-up sheet at the back. If you sign up for it, we will send you a copy of all the Arabic words that you're not supposed to utter, that are Islamic terms that belong to the faith. And I hope you have the questions that we will entertain that will come up. Now I want to ask Altaf about some questions that my students raised. And generally speaking, in the classes we teach, we talk about Islam in America prior to 9/11 and post 9/11. Can you talk about the differences within the Muslim community about what happened?
Sure. So one of the things that's very clear, well, my son happened, that's for sure. So he just,
Okay.
I just heard him announce himself that he happened after September 11th.
Okay.
Was that I think the community, to the best way we can characterize it, was somewhat very introverted. Was in the project of building institutions and sort of developing institutions, but having a conversation with ourselves. And September 11th made us realize that it would be very prudent of us to perhaps tell people what exactly happens inside these things we call masjids around America, because somebody else was starting to make a narrative about what they thought happens inside. And so you saw the idea that we went from being introverted to sort of opening up, having open houses, if you will, even being more firm in saying that, in fact, we are American, we are unabashedly American, and we have, for absolutely no reason to feel shy or awkward about saying that we're American, because there was also pressure from people from other parts of the world that don't sell out, don't become American. And if you say that to children who are born and raised here, they say, what else should I be? If I'm born and raised in the land and Islam tells you that you are of the land, wherever you are. So that extrovertedness, if you will translate it in an organizational sense, to reflect many more programs that, and I'm glad our friend Grace mentioned some of the stories, that many more such programs started to happen. And people were very intentional in taking time to explain the faith. Whereas before, and I can tell you from a personal standpoint, growing up in the 80s and 90s, it was mostly Central American immigration with what was happening with El Salvador and Nicaragua and other places. So everyone wanted to know where you were from. After September the 11th, when our children were in the school system and in society, everyone wanted to know what you believed in. It didn't matter where you were from. Now we're concerned with what you believe in. And so youngest of children at 7, 8, 9, and 10 after September 11th were having to become ambassadors of the faith. They explain their faith because something would happen on TV, and then they would say, well, are these your people? And that also helped us to practice our explanations so that we would be not speaking a language alien to people, as you mentioned, these Arabic words. We started using words that were more conducive to sharing the beliefs of Islam without making them immediately sound alien out of an Arabic word. We didn't change the meaning. We just became more proficient at explaining it to people who had perhaps no idea about the faith.
And how do you manage to talk to your kids about their experiences? Because it's tough being the other.
Sure.
And so how do you explain to them?
So I have the advantage of having been the other. As I told you, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and Parma is a suburb which is predominantly white population, mostly Eastern European. So Altaf Hussein was my name. I often thought maybe I should just go with Altaf Husseinsky, and I might just fit right in, and people might be like, oh, he's just a Southern Polish guy, as opposed to the others. So I having gone through that, and my wife as well, who started covering with the hijab, early on in her high school, in middle school and high school years, that we knew what to expect, and so we were able to kind of prepare them. But also, I can tell you, all of my children, it just happens that they were born, Omar was born in 2002 after September 11th. So the reality is that the world that they're in, through Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts, baseball and soccer, which is the typical county leagues, at that level of children, they don't see any tension. They only see love from the other kids. At most, they may be about physical structure, about who beat who up or who is stronger in hitting runs. So they don't have that at that level. What we're preparing them for is actually the life to come, which will be when they leave that cocoon, if you will, of love and compassion in that local community that we have, and go on, and when they're alone. How will they react when they're alone, and if they're singled out at an airport, or if they're questioned, or something is yelled at them? How would they react? And this is something no parent wants to prepare their children for, in as much as recently with the Ferguson and other incidents, no African American mother wants to have to say to her son, this is how you deal with the police. You shouldn't have to do that. But we may have to do that, but we're hoping that the tide is shifting, that enough people are of understanding, and as I mentioned, within the quarters of the government, as well as local and state and national, but also in terms of the interfaith partnerships that are being created. Yeah.
What about any differences that have occurred in the sort of message of the Muslim Student Association? Because I remember when I first started writing about Muslims in America, the Muslim Student Association was mostly foreign students. And now we have American-born students. So is there a difference in the message?
So it is true that the organization was founded by students who came from overseas, and their concerns, as if you look at the writings of anyone who studied the Irish Catholic community in the 1840s, predominantly it was a concern with Ireland. And over time, over 80, 100 years, which is why there's a book, How the Irish Became White, this is what happened, is that the Muslim Student Association started to have people who were from America, who perhaps rarely spoke Arabic, or rarely spoke another language and only spoke English. So their main medium of communication became English. And so they actually started taking on the concerns through an American lens of healthcare and inequities in those who are underinsured and uninsured, or perhaps poverty. And so they began programs here in America for Americans, or for people of within America. So that shift is something painful, because to those who are watching it, they assume that this means a disengagement from the Ummah or the broader international Muslim community. But for us, it is, actually as American as you can be, which is to be here and to have the concern of the entire world, in the sense of what can we do to help fight malaria, as Bill Gates and Melinda Gates, the foundation, are doing. That's a typically American thing. So that was an internal pain that the community went through, is thinking, would this mean that the children would abandon the faith? When in fact, I'm writing more about this, is that they became faith-inspired to do those things. That the faith inspired them to do those things, and to have, to have programs, and even extend it to whether it's the Hillel on campus, or whether it is to, to have InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, whether it is to create those alliances, because we're all trying to keep, all of our memberships are low, let's just be frank. And so when we try to get the membership high and active involvement, it seems like we can bring them together with such projects. Yeah. So mostly an internal focus, but not forgetting the external community as well, the international community.
The other thing that I've noticed is prior to 9/11, there was a great deal of emphasis in the mosques about getting somebody from the Arab world or from India or Pakistan who had specific knowledge to come and sort of initiate them in Islam over there.
Right.
And then after 9/11, I ran a test on my students and asked them, who's your guru? And I was surprised. In 2005, everyone they listed was a white convert to Islam. And so I pressured, and finally it dawned on me that what had happened is the Muslims had identified the white convert as someone who is American and yet willing to stand up against all the Islamophobia and say, I am Muslim. Right now, in 2009, I passed the question again to a different class, and everyone was a Muslim, American-born Muslim leader. And I was wondering whether you can tell us about the new leadership, since you've written about it, the new Islamic leadership that is sort of creating an American Islam.
And again, why I love being a student essentially of America as a nation of immigrants. And Professor Aristide Zolberg of New York University wrote a book, A Nation by Design, that in fact it is very much a nation by design, and that whether it was the Lutherans or the Catholics and others who imported back then the priests and even some of the funding to build the institutions, that our community went through that. And so for the longest time, it was the imported imam, if you will. And while the young people who have come of age have become the American Muslim scholars, who are perhaps from the ethnic background of other Arab or Indian or Pakistani or other national backgrounds, they were studying. So the American converts that came into the fold and sort of started explaining the religion, these were the students who were inspired by them about the Americanness of Islam, that you could be in fact a very articulate ambassador of the faith without ever compromising aspects of the faith. And so these people who have come of age now, who are of immigrant, let's say, ancestry, then they are quintessentially the second and third generation, and people who are perhaps only raised in America, who have no such confusion about what Islam means to them within the American context. And they're also getting a greater following, because they're very specialized. Some of them have developed Arabic learning institutions, and these are a year-long programs, sometimes summer-long programs. And instead of having to send our children anywhere overseas, they can study in America, and they can study Arabic, within the context of the faith. That also, with security and other reasons in terms of some of the just the precarious nature of some of these other countries, that this was a great a development. And that's helped us in many ways, because we've also realized that if you wanted to perpetuate the faith, it couldn't be done at the hands of imported people who had their own sort of concept of what Islam meant. And I'll be quite frank with you, some of them had a very difficult time translating the teachings into the spoken English, if you will. And so the idea was that they would struggle with trying to connect with the young children, and here would come somebody born and raised in America who would take a basketball game analogy. They may refer to the Duke win last night and somehow bring it back to Islam, and the kids would just listen. whereas the other person may have been historically talking about historic incidents with no relationship to the current and to the present. So that's a great development, and we're promoting more of that, including with the Hartford Seminary, for example, who's training some of our chaplains to go out and serve the campus institutions.
Can you name a few of them and whether they're is there a new development of anything we can call a Muslim American theology or a Muslim American?
Yeah, so I try to stick to social work as much as I can.
I'm going to take you on a social work.
But I mean, I would say that in essence, it is an American Islam. So we can agree on that. And some of these people who are, if you Google their names, you'll see the followers they have and the number of hits and all these things they get are, of course, the white American or convert American imams, if you will, would be Imam Hamza Yusuf, who just, along with Imam Zaid Shakir, founded Zaytuna College, which is the first liberal arts Muslim college in California. It would take California for something like that to happen, as with everything American, things start out west and then they slowly come to the Midwest and East. So he's there. Imam Zaid Shakir is there, of course. And then within and of course, Suhaib Webb is an Oklahoman, white American, if you will, and basically has a major following and is recently moved to Washington, D.C., and is beginning, a ministry, if you will, here in this area. Among the immigrant imams or the immigrant scholars who are emerging, we have recently, from a PhD from Yale, Dr. Yasser Qadi. Of course, you have Noman Ali Khan, who I mentioned the Arabic learning program for a year. He himself studied and then made it easier for others to access the religion, the faith, the language, so they could access the faith. You have Omar Suleiman, who is of Palestinian descent, raised in New Orleans, born and raised, I think, in New Orleans, and very much a strong following. And again, these are just some of them. And of course, there are also women scholars emerging. Dr. Ingrid Mattson from the convert side, if you will, a Canadian who rose to become the first president, female president of the Islamic Society of North America, and made tremendous contributions there, as well as Sister Yasmin Mujahid, who's another person whose writings, and it's important, I think, to continue the tradition of literary scholarship, that the contributions are through writings, and sometimes we get into this sort of online culture of everything either is by a tweet or a text or a link, but these people are actually writing in their fields, and so there are some of the names, yeah.
You brought up the culture of the internet, and I realized that Muslims have colonized a major area of the internet. There's a lot of material there, and also there is a lot of material about not dating, but finding husbands or wives or whatever. Can you tell us a little bit about the internet, Islam?
Sure. So, when the printing press was introduced, and I'd start there because it's a very direct correlation to what Dr. Haddad means about how Muslims have embraced, including the scholars, the internet. When the printing press was introduced, the Muslim scholars were very hesitant to have the Quran manually, technologically, if you will, reprinted, because they were very afraid that someone would play with the words and move things around, and in the typesetting or whatever errors would be introduced. So we were a few hundred years before we embraced the printing press, to our own detriment, not to say the least. Then the radio came, and people were still sort of worried, what does the radio mean? Then came the television. When the internet came, I don't have an exact documentation, but we think within 2 to 3 years of the internet sort of becoming widespread, because even I wasn't talking about the World Wide Web when I was in the 90s in undergraduate or graduate studies, but it became. So within 2 to 3 years, the scholars realized that this was a very amazing means of disseminating the message of the faith to wide audiences. Then it also gave rise to the fact that at the same time the community was experiencing almost a decline in the support systems that would help people to get married, as you brought up marriage, for example, just one example. So the support systems would have meant what? That almost every family of immigrant background particularly, and it's also the case with American families in very when they identify with their neighborhood in a big way, they say, I'm from the south side of Chicago, and then everyone sort of knows each other, or whatever the case is. In this case, families would know one another, so if somebody was being referred for marriage, it was just a matter of Whereas in larger societies, 6 degrees of separation. Within the Muslim society, 2 degrees of separation. And that's to our detriment again, because then too many people knew about your business and too many people knew about everything. So when that system was sort of falling apart and people were moving a lot and not maybe having as many of those connections, the internet became a great place for people to disseminate ideas about, well, how does it work when you don't have that support system? How can you engage within the, again, faith-inspired search for your spouse, and also how do you manage a married life, with all of the stresses and strains on time and on scheduling and whatnot. So the internet with YouTube and everything else has become a great tool. Now we are also just as concerned, because we're not living in a sort of hate to use the reference cave, but yeah, we're not living in that setting, let's say, where we don't know what's happening outside. So I did attend a one-day seminar, seminar sponsored by YouTube. Google actually hosted us in California, where several of the scholars, Muslim scholars and other people active in the community, came to talk about radicalization and an idea that the internet is also being used by those who would want to harm not only other Muslims, but in fact anyone who wouldn't agree with their philosophy. So we started realizing that here are two different tensions. So on the one hand, you can support the community, grow it. I can give you the example. The internet would not have, if it wasn't for the internet, for example, the 3 young students, college students who were murdered in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, had started a small fund to provide medical assistance and dental assistance to the refugees of Syria. At their death on February the 10th, that amount had reached, online campaign had reached $18,000. Today, it is well past $500,000 in their death. So posthumously, they have done more in terms of raising awareness and funds because of the internet. So people didn't have to be in America, for example, to contribute. They could be anywhere in the world. But also, in America, Muslims and people of other faiths started to contribute. So we're seeing that tension whereby it could be used for a lot of good, but there's also very much a realization that it can be used for harm. It can be used to, a young boy or a girl sitting alone in their room somewhere to have their entire, thinking turned upside down in terms of who they are, where they were born, where did they belong to, and make them actually stand up against that. And this is not just, for us as Muslims. The Southern Poverty Law Center documents the rise in right-wing hate groups, also recruiting by the internet. So this is a common concern, and it's a common human concern that the internet could be used for both good and harm.
One of the things is how to negotiate your way through the internet. I know you can get different fatwas, for example, legal opinions. If you have a problem, you can. I had one student go to the internet to a fatwa site, and she asked the question, I met a Christian, and I'm interested in him. Can I marry him? And the answer came from South Africa in 10 minutes. No, my daughter. Right? From South Africa. So how do you teach your young people how to know what is an authentic place where they can get their information? Because a lot of Islamic thought is available on the internet.
Sure.
But some of it is very radical, some of it is very liberal, some of it is anti-Muslim.
Sure.
So how do you teach your young people how to find their way?
Yeah. So it's a parent concern. So if I can just start there, that in fact even it's a concern for myself, because in the age of rushing and researching, you could come across a website and you could actually look up something and you think you have something, but you haven't read the full where it says read more. It'd be a good idea to click there and to read more, because they may tell you we are extremists, radical, whatever, and you're like, why did I take that? In this example, it's happening more and more that people want a quick answer. And it's more so for expedience and personal convenience than an adherence to the faith. Because if the person or anyone who was interested in finding the patience it takes to go to a scholar of the faith to unabashedly explain to them the situation I've gotten myself in, and then say, now help me to understand within the faith, how shall I move next? That has embarrassment, it has shame, it has stigma, which is in almost any religious community. So this is one of the challenges we're having. So we're telling children more and more, in fact, through our conferences and other community gatherings, that we have avenues for you to ask these questions. So in as much as we have pieces of paper to write down questions here, in camps, in winter camps, summer camps, the children write down their questions. So we have people who are of their peers or slightly older who can help them navigate some of these pitfalls essentially to getting that, what in some scholars have called almost like fatwa shopping. And they're doing 1-800-FATWA, so I go to one scholar and he says no, so I go to another one, hopefully he's awake and he says yes, or I go to somebody else and then I take, triangulation and say, well, these look like no, so I'll take the yes. So this is, somebody who is really shopping. And they'll stop when they have found what they like, as opposed to found what we are emphasizing God likes, or what is pleasing to God. And that's never never convenient. And sometimes it's in fact painful to come to the realization that maybe what I would like is not aligning with my faith. And so I have to now step back and say, do I just push ahead because this is what I like? Or do I actually modify my desire in terms of whatever it is I'm trying to get done, or the question I have? Even financial transactions, where there are interest-based financial transactions, a lot of issues in terms of, again, moving quickly or being patient and trying to do the best according to the religion. And again, it's not a resolved situation, but in fact, it is worrisome because of the fact that it is so accessible. That in fact, we even call them, we call Google, we call anyone who is learned, or in Arabic, somebody who is older, Sheikh. So you may hear Sheikh so-and-so. So we actually have Sheikh Google because people are actually going on to Google and Googling their way through the faith. And in reality, it is not helpful because the authenticity of which is not credible. And which is my students, if they ever quote Wikipedia in the references section, inevitably fail. Because Wikipedia is only as accurate as the next person who updates it. So it's clearly not a source of knowledge or information in terms of the academic setting. Yeah.
Now, I understand that your wife is from Egypt, and you're from India. Yes. So there are two cultures, very different. And you had Omar Abdullah write a paper which young people have been, they got very charged up by it. How to create an American Islam, because he divided the Muslim world into culture zones. Yeah, and you have you have a Turkish Islam, a Persian Islam, an African Islam, an East Asian Islam, a South Asian Islam. So why can't we have an American Islam? Sure. So how do you negotiate cultural differences, especially in the mosque setting, at home, and how do you create an American Muslim culture?
Well, one way to do that is that your children pretty much force you to do it because they don't know any other culture. They only know the American culture. And so in their minds, when you insist on something with which neither are they familiar, and you, by virtue of only coming at the age of 10, are half familiar, are only going to have so much success because they ask you why. And you just have to sit there and think, oh God, now what? And then you Google it because you think, how can I? But my wife, in the case of my wife and I and other couples who are, of different racial backgrounds, we had very early on, we had been both raised to love the faith. And so it wasn't, and my mother-in-law's here, so it wasn't that we were looking at races and ethnicities, we were looking at faith as the binding factor. And then, of course, we negotiated within that we would be teaching the children from the faith and then down, so that if there were things that were happening in terms of religious holidays, what foods do you eat? So they get, luckily, to eat both sides of the food, because my parents are also within a few miles, my mother-in-law, and they're in a few miles, so they get to have both. So let's say that was that. Or dress, for example. We don't insist on any one type of dress, as long as the religion, which says it should be modest. So if you're modest in your dress, then you could be wearing an Egyptian, if you're a galabeya, which is the long robe, if you will, or you could be wearing a shalwar kameez, which is like a South Asian dress. So we kind of kept it at that. But what I do see happening, and I think we should really cheer this on in terms of other immigrant communities that are coming, is that the notion that you can be free to express yourself within the faith in America is something that is not possible in other Muslim countries. So you can't actually actively marry across races in other countries because they're just they haven't come to that level yet. So we have to face that. even to the degree of sort of intimate relationships and family friendships and whatnot. People may be more sticking to their own races. But in America, I mean, in any masjid, if you go on any given night of the Ramadan prayers I talked about, you may see somewhere between 70 to 90 countries. Diana Eck from Harvard in the Pluralism Project documented this. It is baffling. So the only thing uniting all of them would be English, because even Arabic may not be spoken by all of them, and then their own native language would be so diverse and distinct. So English is the uniting factor. So now you start to see variations of the American culture emerging by virtue, if you will, of this insistence that the faith is the lens through which everything is possible. And the paper that you referred to, Islam and the Cultural Imperative, is really, was really one of the first times a scholar said, look, Islam has looked like whatever culture it was part of. So he says, Islam in China looked Chinese. So if you go to China, you will not find masjids with domes and massive structures as you would in Middle East or North Africa or even South Asia. You would find them looking like Chinese architecture, which is the beauty of it. There's nothing antithetical to having that architecture, in as much as the culture as well is also Chinese very much. And one of the largest minority populations of Muslims is in China, which is something unknown to us. And that came from the fact that they could hold on, be Chinese, and yet be a Muslim in terms of their faith. Yeah.
So I'm going to a conference in New York next week, and it's about youth culture in America, Muslim youth culture. So I'm arguing, I want your input into it. I'm arguing that, the children of the immigrants are taught, they become sort of part of the culture of their parents, whether they like it or not. They go to the school, they are American. So they're caught in between, but they know how to negotiate it. The minute they get out of the door, they become American. The minute they come home, they become Indian or Chinese or whatever. So what is this in-between culture? I mean, I've been looking at some of the novels that Muslims are writing, looking at some of the music. Some of it is religious music, but we also have, we have a cowboy musician, and we have what's his name?
Kareem Salama is the cowboy.
Yeah, Kareem Salama, but then there is Malik, Zayn Malik. You missed him. He's the tween idol, whatever. He just got out of some very important group.
You mean Maher Zain, or is it Zayn Malik? Baby, I don't know.
No, Zayn Malik.
Yeah.
You should Google him.
How I got tenure is by not listening to music. Yeah.
You should Google him.
I will.
He has.
Zayn Malik.
He has millions of tweens. Like 13-year-olds that follow him, and he just opted out of a sort of a group, and so everybody's mad at him. So the question is, how do you identify Islamic culture?
One of the principles that we've been taught very early on, and I think this is probably the most helpful thing, is that within Islam, everything from your culture is permissible, except that which within the religion is impermissible. So if I repeat that again, in Islam, everything in your culture, wherever culture you're from, is permissible, except that which Islam makes explicitly impermissible. So for example, I cannot say, well, my culture, we drink a lot, and so this is just part of our culture, we should take it. Well, if Islam says it's clearly forbidden alcohol, then that's the only thing you will leave aside. But everything else from your culture, your habits, your food, your cultural traditions, within the framework that are acceptable, which is a great way for our children to be raised. And my father, who's a poet and then a PhD in information science, who taught us in rhymes almost everything. So when we first reached America, I remember him telling us, and I kept looking at him like, what else is there? Because it was basically a couplet. He said, take from the West what fits within Islam the best, and leave in the East what fits within Islam the least. So I won't repeat that because that's just a father-son, father-children. But the idea was what? That there's much in America that will fit into your faith, so take it. And there's much within where we come from that is actually not helpful to your faith, so leave it. So take from the West what is best, and leave in the East what is, and this is working. because now you have all these, not only entertainment, because one of the things every religious community is struggling with is how do you get the youth to be entertained? No matter where I go to give a lecture, I could prepare the most and give the lecture. If I didn't make one joke, the whole lecture, it wasn't a good lecture. So when you come out, they're being raised on this entertainment culture, and you ask them, what was great about it? Oh, that guy was funny. I'm thinking, no, I'm trying to get tenure. I am not funny. I am not a comedian, and I'm not, so entertainment is a big deal. And so within the culture, we're finding out we have comedians now who are Muslims, and again, there's a group called Allah Made Me Funny. So this group was formed after September the 11th. It's a son of Indian immigrants who's a lawyer, a son of Palestinian immigrants, and a son of African Americans, or I think he converted to Islam. So these three together are called Allah Made Me Funny. And so they tell jokes, the others sing. So you have bands, you have comedians. So the children start to realize it's not as confined as the immigrants who came in the 60s and 70s made it out to seem. In your research, the book Islamic Values in America, basically in the United States, pointed that out, that you couldn't sustain the perpetuation of the faith if it stayed restricted and through the lens of an overseas lens. Dr. Suleiman Yang, who's a professor at Howard University, often talks about how parents tried to raise their children, but the soundtrack, in America with the soundtrack of India or Pakistan or Iran or wherever they're from, and that never works because you're trying to drive in America with the map of somewhere else. And so we've over time had to come with this, this idea of who the youth are. Their assertiveness is American. But in our cultures, that assertiveness is disrespect. How could you look up at your grandfather and look him in the eyes? Well, all our kids are going, grandfather, what, are you making up stuff? And they just talk, they just look up and talk because this is America. But we're also telling them it's still respect matters. Be entertained, be amused and do all of those things. But when it comes time for the faith, then just navigate. And that's why I think the studies will show this as the psychological trauma that a child could undergo. If they're negotiating this and navigating this successfully, but a segment of America says, no matter what you say or do, we will never accept you. And that child grows up with self-hatred, with self-esteem issues, self-worth. This is the worst nightmare that I have, is that after doing all of what we're doing, that these children still have to face that segment. And that could be anywhere, anytime. And that's the worst nightmare for us because we think, at what point do we stop, do we just tell them, how much do we tell them, we love you, we want you to stay within the faith, but everything around them, if it's gathering storm, if it's a gathering storm, will tell them the best way to stay in America and be accepted is to abandon this faith. And that's never good for anybody because we saw what happens over time when children get lost in those formative years from the rooting of a faith, whatever faith it is, not just Islam, but whatever faith it is. So that's my concern. A lot of my writings, my traveling is to speak to the youth and to let them know that you can contribute to America if you can be the best Muslim and the best American. And that together is one body, it's not two separate bodies. Yeah.
Thank you. I can go on, but you guys, do you have questions? Can you talk about the tensions within the community? I mean, you've been talking as though we have this wonderful community, but anywhere where you have three people, there are three opinions.
Well, so, and I did point out some of the internal tensions and problems, but this particular issue within the Muslim community comes from the idea that at any one point, as we're developing an American Islam or a Muslim community in America, and as Dr. Haddad pointed out, the preposition matters. It's not Islam in America or Muslims in America, it is Muslims of America. And that preposition was an amazing, just two letters to say in, which is very temporary and transient, and of, meaning of the land. And the notion there is that as we're developing this, even as we sit here, some family just landed at Dulles Airport, who is a brand new either refugee or immigrant family, who is coming with all of their perceptions of America, either positive or negative. And so they walk into our institutions and we don't have a solid way to socialize them into this American Islam. So that tension is ever present at JFK, at Dulles, in Houston, at Los Angeles, wherever they're coming. So this is the most constantly changing community by virtue of that, whereas other, mostly European communities, the mass immigration fairly ceased. It's there. It's not as hundreds, maybe thousands, but not the tens of thousands that are coming every year. So that's one source of tension that's constantly there. And that also means the tension between you are the American sellouts, because you do this and your wife drives and your your sisters did this and that. That's a gender inequality and that stuff they're bringing from overseas that within Islam is not really present in the sense of equity and equitable roles for men and women in the society. The second tension comes theologically, and what we understand is that within the 4 major schools of thought within the faith, or even 5 if you will, that sometimes the tension arises from who wants to control the structure of governance within a religious institution by virtue of dictating that now for this next 2-year term, it'll be our school of thought. And that's something that is being resolved more often and more commonly now by virtue of the children growing up in America say, I grew up with people who are from all of those 4 schools or 5 schools of thought. So I have no tension with them. Whereas if you come from predominantly Muslim countries, you may have only been exposed to one school of thought in Malaysia or one school of thought in Saudi Arabia or somewhere else. But when you come to America, you're starting to grow up, if you will, with that. And that literally means the way we pray. What one school understood to be the postures of the hand in terms of standing in front of God with the hands clasped on just at my abdomen, standing with the hands. And these are tensions, again, for the new immigrants and the established community. Because they say, well, it should only be one, and there's no room for multiplying or pluralistic understanding within one community. And we say, you can't. You can't have a Reform Islam community and an Orthodox community or a conservative community or a neoliberal. You just have one community, and everyone sort of starts to create space for each other, because the larger message is, how do you practice where you are? And theologically, wherever you are, just don't dictate it to others. And that's still in a work in progress. It's not impossible, but it's there. It's emerging. And thank Allah, thank God, that the Shia-Sunni sectarian conflict did not translate into, did not appear in America as it did overseas, especially in the last decade and a half or so. That even there was a signing of leadership from Shia and the Muslim and the Sunni community to basically almost a code of coexistence, to say that will not impact us here. And so it's not clearly a community without tensions, but there is hope that in as much as everyone is committed to promoting the understanding of the faith externally, the practice of the faith internally, we have a framework within which we can get along and work and go forward. Yeah.
And one of my students, one of my students wanted to know, and I will report to her your answer. She said, how is it possible, given the fact that you don't have a pope or an archbishop, how when you have these multiple authorities, how do you manage to keep the religion going? What are the foundations which keep it going?
So this, I don't think it will change, to just be clear, that there will not, because the result of having a pope essentially is the establishment of what the Muslims call the Khilafah, or what we called with the Ottoman, the Caliphate, in the anglicized version. That is not on the horizon. So even if somebody tried to misinterpret or misreport what we did here today, we don't see that on the horizon. There's no election, there's no campaign going on for someone to become Khalifa, to bring everybody under one. So what we can do is to say that how do we, within the American, within the European, within the African, Asian traditions, how do we actually begin to manage the affairs of the community through consultation? And to the best way possible, what we're seeing now is the emergence of councils. So Southern California, I was there. They had the 20th anniversary of their council that brought together over 100 different mosques, masjids, under this sort of framework of cooperation and collaboration on programs and activities. So the idea is that I don't think we'll get there. In terms of if we mean an exact juxtaposition of the Pope and a centralized Muslim leadership, we may not get there. But to the extent that, in this case, the Catholic Church is very organized, we can get there, because we have these emerging structures within not only Europe and the councils, but also in the US and in Canada, that it's approaching that level. but it may never be a uniform or single, one leader, if you will, in that tradition.
I have a question here. He says, how many Muslims in the world and how many in the US?
So we always have to give an elaborate answer, and I'm glad my graduate assistant, Miss Stephanie Howard, is actually in the audience. She'll tell you, and on any given day, you can decide what the population is. And if that makes you happy, go ahead, because we know who we see, we know how many there are. So if you look at some of the sources, they say 2 million. And I say, if you just go to Chicago, or if you just go to Los Angeles, or if you just go to Houston or Dallas, you would know that we're clearly past 2 million at some point. On the other hand, we've been saying we're around 6-7 million ever since I was young. And I got married, I had 4 kids. So at least it went up to 7.002 million or something. So somewhere, because we don't keep track, as you know, from the federal government in terms of census by religion, we say we're somewhere in between. 2 to 7 million in terms of the U.S. context, and growing. And I'm almost certain it will, if you want to scare the people in the Midwest especially and say the Muslims are coming, then you say there's 10 million of them, and say, really, I've never seen one. Well, there's 10 million of them. They're here. You just don't know where they are. And then if you want to marginalize the community, you can say there's no more than 1.52 million of them. Just don't pay attention. So in the world, we've also been saying 1 billion. And I tell you that India, where my ancestry alone, the country's population is 1 billion something, and the numbers show between 250 to 300 million. Of those, 1 billion something are Muslim. So if you keep multiplying that with Indonesia as a mostly Muslim country, Egypt itself, Cairo's population alone is in the tens of millions, then you start to realize that it's somewhere again between 1 billion and 1.2 billion, and perhaps growing. So that's the short answer. Not at all scientific, because how are you going to measure this? But those are the broad estimates in terms of people who did try to extrapolate based on, and how they did do it. The people who do this sort of counting is looking at the immigrant population and then extrapolating from the population of that country, from the CIA fact book, if you will, in terms of if Somalia is 99.9% Muslim, then if we had 100,000 Somalis come in, we can say there are approximately 100,000 of Somali Muslims in America, and so on and so forth. But that's not even as accurate again. So I don't want us to have a debate about the population. At least know that between my own family and my wife's family, there's 30 of us. That I can account for, and that's for sure. Yeah.
When people ask me, I always say Allahu A'lam.
Oh yeah, which is God knows. And you try that raising kids, and they don't go for that. They're like, Google it now, and then you can talk about God, right?
Why is Islam the fastest growing religion in the world?
And again, if you go with the narrative that it is the fastest growing religion in the world, by virtue of 3 things, and all of the literature points this out, that there is within the European and American context growth through natural births, through immigration, and through conversion or reversion, however the people want to say. Some people believe that you want to call them reverse to the faith or converts. It's a minor distinction. But the point is that I think what's happening is that perhaps quantifiably it's not the fastest growing, because again, as I mentioned, I'm not at all saying that we have an exact number, but the exposure of it also makes it possible for more people to find out that it exists. Where if you don't know something, you'll probably say, well, all the polls, if you look at CNN, Washington Post, whoever, if they ask them, are Islamic values compatible with American values? Or resounding no. And the next question is, do you know any Muslims? Resounding no. So when that question is changed, do you know any Muslims? Yes. Then that person probably answered yes to the first question, because in their personal lives, they don't see contradiction. So it may be fast growing in this on both levels, perhaps by population, but also because of the exposure of the faith, particularly in the post-September 11th decade.
This question asks, how do mosques in America differ in their depiction of Islam? Example, are there Shiites or Sunni differences, mosques, institutions?
It's hard to quantify that, other than to say that the differences are not in the physical structure, perhaps, because the ornate structure of a mosque, masjid, which is also referred to sometimes as the house of God, in as much as the cathedral, so much was invested in decorating the house of God and making it look beautiful and lofty and all of that, that's there. And from a fundraising point of view, we actually are so against that, because it costs so much to build those structures when you should be putting it into programming and activities and and serving the youth and all of those things. But on the other hand, it is predominantly in the practice of the faith within the mosques, within the masjid. So a Shia mosque may have a slightly different governance structure than perhaps a Sunni masjid, which may allow lay people to be in charge of masjid affairs in terms of operations. And that may not be the case in Shia, where there's a much more organized organized hierarchy in terms of, or hierarchical structure in terms of religion and the understanding of the faith. And that's something to be respected. So that may be the difference. But I haven't seen, and somebody could correct me if they know differently, I haven't seen distinctly a physical structure, but in the governance, I can say there is a difference. Yeah.
Why is Islam thought of as militaristic in spite of the concept of peace?
Okay, so here's a commercial break, pausing for station identification. The third lecture in this series is by Khalid Al-Gindi from the Brookings Institution on the political system of Islam. So he will clearly elaborate on that, and it'll only be about that as well. But what I can say is that, there is no faith that can sit here today or anywhere, that can say that we didn't have something to do with hurting someone of another faith. Now, how we depicted that, the late Edward Said and others who wrote about it, the depiction of the Muslim and the Arab as the other, and even Jack Shaheen, if you Google that name, Shaheen, he did a study of film in America, 100 years basically, and of real bad, Arabs, real, R-E-E-L, real bad Arabs. So if we've been socialized to think that violence is the innate, possession of these people, then anything I say, no matter what I say. I mean, sometimes I smile because no matter what image on the front page of a magazine, it's of a Muslim bearded man with his mouth open. And he may have been yawning, but the photographer took it to make it look like he was, cursing and this and that. And I say, if you just step back a little bit and look at it and say, in America today, for example, and there are Arabic words which clearly say, like Hizb Allah, the party of Allah, the idea of the army of God. There is a right-wing hate group in America, if you look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, actually called the army of God. Now, if you translate that into Arabic, that would be pretty much an Arabic word that would sound something like, it wouldn't necessarily say Hizbullah, but Jund Allah, like the army or the, So the idea is what? If you just want to make it sound foreign, turn something we have in English into Arabic, right? The cute people who stand and want to collect money in their outfits of Santa Claus, what group do they represent? I'm sorry, what is the full name? Yeah, so if you translate it into Arabic, it doesn't sound so good. It sounds like all the stuff that they say on the news. So I'm trying to say to us, let's just look to see what is the passion that tells people to use words like army and this, that, not to discount the fact that there are extremists who have hijacked the faith, who have said that this my way and absolutely no other way. And so, of course, if you put those people's words up, they make the news, and that is the militaristic, if you will, look of Islam. We're not denying the fact that there were battles within the faith. Battles fought by Muslims against people of other faiths. We're not denying any of that. No one is trying to, sugarcoat it or anything. But the fact is today, presently, who is responsible for that image? Some portion of Muslims are, but by far they are a cult of terror, and that's what they represent. They do not represent necessarily the teachings of the faith. And there's no matter how much we keep saying this, it's never going to be heard. There's always going to be some well-meaning person who says, you don't condemn this enough. And that's why people think you're militaristic. We say, yes, we just got condemning it. And they say, but I didn't see it. Well, so because you didn't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So we're having to be patient with one another. Even as we say we are a religion of peace and trying to do well, we also have a minority, a very minute minority, who is responsible for very, very grave acts of terror in the name of the faith, as misguided as they may be.
Well, this other question is about Sunni Shia violence, sectarian violence, which you partially answered, but the question is, why is it, in the rest of the world, does that tension exist in the U.S.?
So it exists explicitly overseas, and it is, in fact, the most tragic thing, because as we gather, most Muslims and most Christians gather on Sunday, and then the Jewish community on Saturday. Muslims gather on Friday. When I go to bed on Thursday night, I tell you not, in the last decade, my prayer has always been, let me wake up with no news of someone from either of these two, Sunni or Shia, who took it upon themselves to go to that Friday congregation and blow it up in the name of whatever it is that they think they understand. That's an overseas thing. I pray to Allah that that never comes here. We've seen every sign to say that there is increasing understanding and cooperation between Sunni and Shia communities here, but it is majority an overseas concern, which we are regrettably dealing with because of the pain of families who are here, whose family members may die in some of these attacks. But it's mostly an overseas thing, which we're very sad about.
Are you aware there's a young group of Muslim students in Washington, D.C. who call themselves Sunni Shia, and it's called sushi?
Yes, yeah. So if I don't know what different way to say an American Islam is emerging, other than people who talk about sushi. So we have, in fact, if you Google her name, Najat Bazzi from Michigan, grew up with a Sunni father, I believe, and a Shia mother, or one of the, but that's what she goes by. She goes, I'm a sushi because I'm Sunni and also Shia. So, it's all, it is, I don't ever like to make things lighthearted, but it is possible for people to live together. The reality is the political divides and the possibly ego and of one or two individual leaders who drive these masses into hysteric, understanding and even actions. That's the troubling thing, and we're hoping that it won't happen here in America.
Does the Quran condone harm to those who do not convert to Islam?
So, again, back to social work and to stay within the framework of what I'm professed to do, which is social work. There is a verse in the Quran that explicitly says, let there be no compulsion in religion. So if I just tell you that, what that means in my life. So I can advise my children to pray. I can encourage them to practice. I may never come to the point of forcing them to do anything. That's just within the family of a Muslim husband, a father and a mother. So if you take that away from, into a different understanding, there is no such thing as saying convert or die, because that would be antithetical to this teaching that says let there be no compulsion in religion. And so what we're finding is that there are people who misinterpret verses from the Quran which talk about, and again in very graphic terms, of people who are infidels or people who are disbelievers. And the reality is, to reach that level within our society with this much, regrettably, ignorance about the faith, you couldn't even get the status of a disbeliever if you tried. If you have to be aware of the faith and then actively be fighting somebody against the faith to get into that category of fighting for the sake of conversion or not. It's not happening, in the sense of we can't go to anybody and force them to convert. We can't go to them and say convert or die. This is not part of the faith. Has it happened? Yes, it's happened throughout history, because people became zealots and very excited about their message. But if my excitement actually about my faith transgresses the bounds of my faith, then I'm not anymore preaching that faith. I'm actually preaching my personal understanding and my personal excitement, if you will, about the faith. So I don't see that as something that any scholar would say is a part of the faith.
So how would you answer your son if he comes and quotes another verse from the Quran which says the exact opposite? Such as whoever takes a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from them,
right, and that's different in the sense that if you're,
there are other verses like a verse about those who have in الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب, those who have disbelieved. Yeah. So there are verses that would. I mean, it's a tension within the Quran. When I'm teaching, we're always trying to figure out, okay, how do you sort of relate these verses to each other? Because they are, nitpicking. Sure. They're taking certain verses and using them. And I know that the person in 2 weeks will be talking about this, and I'm going to push him on it. No problem. But since the question came...
And we can extend the conversation to basically say that there are certain verses that are quite universal in their understanding and actually transcend time chronologically. Right. There are others that are within the Quran, because the Quran is at once a book of history as well. So there are also verses that are very contextual to what was occurring at that time and not to be taken out of context. And so the reality there's much more discussion about forgiveness and mercy and compassion and living together as there is, historically speaking, the context of where something did happen. And so if they were disbelieving after having relations with you and then fighting you, then fight back, but not go and offensively fight them in order to get them to I mean, it doesn't even intuitively make sense, because of what value is it to force someone to believe something, as we're raising teenagers, to believe something which it'll last as long as they're in front of you and out of fear. When they're out of sight, what is to get them to not change and not to shift? And that introduction of violence into it, I think, is part of that militarization narrative, that all they ever do is get angry and upset and then they'll fight us. And we're saying that if you follow that narrative within the American context, I don't know of any Muslims in America who said, this is a place we have to leave, because I mean, even before September 11th or after, that this is a land that doesn't believe in Islam. No, in fact, they became stronger in their faith. And some of your research documented it by virtue of the migration, because they found they could be free of cultural baggage and misinterpretations of the faith and all that. And this was a reality of it.
What do you think is the best way to reach immigrant youth to counteract the recruitment of ISIS or other radical forces?
And we're actively working on this through the local level, not only forming youth groups, inviting people, especially the newer immigrant families where I come from, which is the Adams Center community. They have youth groups. They even have, for example, youth outings, youth camps, Friday discussions. So some of this is a safe space to just say what they feel. So I want to hear from them. If they say, for example, why would I care about a country that pretty much tells me I'm a terrorist from birth? I want them to be able to say that to me or someone who grew up here, so we can say to them, you are not everything everyone tells you you are. You are who you are by virtue of your faith and your understanding. So we're investing time, energy, but I can tell you, quite frankly, it is not an easy task. Because even as we're sitting here having this program, someone is uploading a YouTube clip that speaks against Islam. Someone is having a program on some college campus that may be, speaking out against Islam or putting out anti-Islamic bigotry through their writings or their, whatever it is they're doing. And so that tide is huge. But there are more Muslim youth who are American born and raised who are actively engaged in saying that this is the example, that do what I did. Go to undergrad, get a college education, social mobility in any society through education, serve the community, use your career to be of impact and influence to people around you. That message, hopefully it will not be drowned out. But it is a welcoming place for immigrant youth especially, who may come, especially refugees. If they come from Iraq, if they come from Somalia, they may have had a lens of America that it would take us some time to undo, but we don't give up on it. And it takes a lot of energy, but we do it. We do it consistently, and hopefully some of it is bearing fruit. Because, and not to say this, that I would ever want to compare or contrast, but Europe, for example, has had many more youth leave to join these radical groups overseas than America has. It's still a concern to us. It's still a concern to us, but we think some of our work is successful because we're minimizing those numbers.
I want to ask you a question myself. How is the community dealing with the anti-Sharia hysteria, in which over 20 states have initiated legislation to ban Muslims from taking over American legal system?
So again, some of this will be covered in, by now, lecture 3, right? But what I can say is that there are 2 reports that you can Google. One is called FEAR, F-E-A-R, FEAR Inc., put out by the Center on American Progress, and then FEAR Inc. 2.0 just came out. And they counted somewhere between 20 to 25 benefactors, if you will, of over $30 million invested to create the hysteria that somehow people whose population number we can't agree upon are actually mobilizing to subvert the Constitution from within. And if this narrative you think is new, then just read the books, for example, by John Higham, H-I-G-H-M, Strangers in the Land, who talks about the Irish Catholic population, who were told to their faces, we will never trust you to uphold the Constitution, we will never give you public office, and we don't trust you to be an American. And that took 120 years to resolve before John Kennedy could become President of America, before 2 years in his term, and he was assassinated. So the Muslims have an uphill battle in the sense of this is a multi-million-dollar cottage industry, but still a massively, a wealthy industry that's putting out this message. What we are doing is getting to know our neighbors, because the neighbors are the people who would be able to say to their representatives, what is wrong with you guys? You sound like idiots. Like literally, you sound like idiots. Talking about some group of Muslims are going to subvert the constitution at the state level, or we have processes in place. They don't just show up and protest and get it to be changed. You have to go through, all sorts of. This is not even something of their goal. No one has even come out saying it's a goal. So stop sounding like that. And so enough of that pressure is going on where some of them have been rescinded, and some of the states, that tried it, it failed. So this is, for me, the most wasted energy. Because this is money being wasted, the precious time of our famous legislators who are trying to get so much done, who were distracting from getting their real work done. That, they want to sincerely get so much done, and we keep distracting them with this stuff. I say, let's stop. Let's be real and say, you know what? We have bigger issues to resolve, such as our education system, healthcare, and even the anti-poverty measures. That's where the focus should be, not anti-Sharia, but anti-poverty, and perhaps then we could stand up and say, we're truly a 21st century superpower who has the credibility for that.
Okay, somebody's asking is, what countries do the various imams who are not citizens come from?
Again, it's hard to know because we don't have a central database or even central leadership, but we can say that, and your glossary does point out, one of the institutions of higher learning, Al-Azhar, for example, has trained a lot of the imams, which is located in Egypt. And it's a very moderate message, and they've come from there. They've come from Pakistan, from India. And again, it's amazing how a group may come together of that particular background, and they will uniquely navigate to bring somebody not only just from their country, but from the province within their country, and potentially from the village where they came from. And you think, how is that possible in this day and age? But that's their thirst for learning the religion in their language. Because it sounds alien to them when we give sermons in English. They don't know what that is. But if you drop a few words of their language, they get it. So these are predominantly North Africa, of course, which I mentioned, Egypt, but not as many anymore. There's still a need for them, because some communities are immigrants, as I mentioned, daily, coming here daily. So they're still bringing, if you will, their imams. Yeah.
There's a question about why do Muslims need to explain their position on conservative dress, on why they have hijab, why they have beards, while other religious groups, like Jews and Christians, don't have to.
The other religious groups have, to some degree, who are in that category of conservative, have also decided the framework of their existence. So they've decided they will engage society or broader society at a certain level. Muslims have said, I don't have to have that framework. I can be a beard-wearing, if you will, man, and run for public office if I want to, or serve at the university, or go into civic institutions. And so that framework is perhaps a self-censoring that hasn't happened in the Muslim community. So if you do that, then people do want to know, hey, didn't you get the email? Right? To appear in America in politics, for example, you can't have facial hair. That memo went out like 100 years ago, right? But if you look at all of our previous leaders, army generals and everybody else, they had some of the best beards. Abraham Lincoln, I want to know who his campaign manager was, right? He had a good beard going for himself. The fact is that if you're going to do that, I want them to ask. I frankly look forward to explain why certain things happen, that in fact I don't, when I board a plane, tuck in my beard so that I can fit in. I leave it as I am because this is who I am. And yet, neither should you feel restricted to practice whatever it is that you're practicing, whoever is there with me. In as much as the coming generations should not feel somehow, as I mentioned, schizophrenic, to think that I will have to leave my Islam here to participate fully here. The best thing that could happen for their psychosocial well-being would be that they could be that faith-inspired person that could serve the community at large, and by doing so, improve the quality of living for everyone, not just for people of their faith. That's the goal.
One question is, please explain fatwa. Beyond being a legal opinion, some of the most infamous fatwas involve directions to kill somebody. So especially somebody who's deemed as an infidel or a heretic, who can legitimately issue a fatwa, and what are the boundaries of what a fatwa can address?
Technically speaking, somebody would have to be... You can issue a fatwa? At Georgetown, perhaps?
I do. To my
Because
students.
you're a tenured full professor. You can issue as many fatwas as you want. Yeah, yeah. I mean, but I think the reality of it is that someone learned within the faith of both the Quran, the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and then the context to apply those teachings. That's who can give a fatwa. So which is why the reality now is that people are actually those who give these fatwas to, and it's a very, very individual process. Let's be very clear about this. For example, if I'm to want to engage in a financial transaction to buy a home, and I want to finance it through a mortgage that was involve interest, I would go to someone learned, explain to them my circumstances. They have to listen to what I'm saying. They have to ask me questions. None of this can happen in this fatwa world of a 1-800 fatwa, or www fatwas are us, or whatever is the new website that's going to come up, because it's just a one-way street. You just tell them, basically a child could say, Mom and Dad won't let me do this. Let me go and tell Sheikh Google to let me know. So he goes on and does it, and they don't ask any questions back. They don't say, what is the context? How old are you? Are you like a 3-year-old who just happened to pound out a message? Or are you in fact somebody who is asking a sincere question? Can we have a follow-up? So this is where, to our detriment, the internet, if you will, has kind of automated, or this notion of getting a fatwa almost instantly and unilateral in one direction. What we're saying is the true fatwa comes from a relationship the person must establish in the form of explaining to the person who is learned all of what they need to about their circumstance, and then having that dialogue, and then they can say, yes, my understanding is, my limited understanding within the teachings is, yes, you can do X, Y, and Z, and no, you cannot do X, Y, and Z.
The questioner is asking, I think the background is Khomeini's fatwa to kill Rushdie.
I didn't want to go there, but yes, yeah. No, let's go there, let's go there. So Salman Rushdie wrote the novel, right? And so the fatwa was there to find him, and to I won't even say because these things are recorded, and they'll only take that clip. I know whoever wants to do this. So they didn't want him to be alive, Salman Rushdie, right?
A euphemism.
The euphemism, yeah. The problem with that is that it takes away from the fact that if you want to write a novel about whatever it is you understand to be Islam, or even a remote understanding of Islam, that is your individual action, and you are responsible for that if you claim to be a Muslim to God. And that's why we don't have a central leadership. That's why we don't have somebody who can monitor all of these things that are happening and say, that one he goes, this one she stays. We can't. So when that happened, most of the moderate, if you will, imams, nobody stood up and said, yes, all of us are with him, go and... No, people just said, what are you talking about? You can't just find somebody and kill them, for what? Let them, they are accountable if they decide that they're Muslim. Clearly, if they're not, then they're in another frame altogether. But within the framework of Islam, we are not called upon to engage in these. And that's why these sensational fatwas, I beg those of our audience and others who may be listening later to just do due diligence. Just go one step further and say, that doesn't make sense because it contradicts everything else I know about the faith. So maybe I shouldn't take it for what it is, but maybe I should take it for perhaps because remember the context of Iran. I mean, let's just be clear. I mean, we're in the middle of talks about the nuclear deal. Anything that came out of Iran wasn't going to be good. So even if they had said, save Salman and bring him lovingly to Iran, they would have said, don't do it because they're going to kill him when he gets there. No one was going to believe in Iran. But the fact was, this was the best sensational thing anybody could do. And thank Allah that no one did it. Thank Allah that whatever security it needed, and he's still, vibrant, is writing. So thank Allah, no one took it upon themselves to do that. And that's something we fear, is that there are people, and I don't like to use this language, but the more you find with gun-related violence, we find a direct correlation with mental health issues. And we as a nation are not confronting that problem, that we have issues with gun violence in our country. And that, if you elevate that, there are many people within perhaps the Muslim community who are radicalized overseas that have all of these complexes, and they're saying, go and kill so-and-so, do with that. And we don't know where in the faith they're getting this, because it is not the faith that we know. And how much protestation it'll take, Allah only knows, but we will not stop protesting until, until the message gets through.
I know you want to go to prayer, but there is one question, and that is, it's about, there are plenty of Bible study groups, and this person wants to find a Quran study group where she doesn't have, I guess it's a woman, doesn't want to wear a hijab. She just wants to study the Quran. Where would that be?
So I would, we would probably want to meet afterwards in terms of, because I mean, I'm not a directory in the sense of, I mean, I know I'm tenured now, but I just don't know everything. But the idea is that we will help you, because there are, smaller individual-based groups that are meeting in their apartments and very much discussing the Quran and Islam generally. And there are also local mosques, masjids, that have programs specifically for people who are either new to Islam or not actually Muslim themselves. There are open gatherings that you're very welcome to do it. And whatever you do, just don't Google it, because we will find you other sources.
Okay, go ahead.
Everybody, thank you, Dr. Hussein and Dr. Haddad.